Welcome back. Today, we're heading deep into the rugged mountains of 19th century Kentucky. We're going to look at a really bloody and frankly mysterious family feud that becomes the key to understanding this powerful cultural force, one that actually shapes our behavior even today. Let's begin with a shocking moment. Imagine a young man named Will Turner who has just been shot, injured, and in pain. He manages to make his way home, but instead of comfort, he is met with a response from his own mother that reveals something remarkable about the world he lived in. It was a society with such strict rules and expectations that even in moments of life and death, people were expected to follow a code of conduct. Our story begins in Harlan, a small town deep in the mountains of Kentucky in the 1800s. This was a remote and isolated place far from the rest of the country. It was here that two of the town's most well-known families, the Howards and the Turners, became locked in a conflict that would eventually turn deadly. And it all began with something as simple as a poker game. What started as a small argument quickly grew into something much bigger. A fist fight became a gunfight, and one killing led to another. Before long, members of the two families were fighting openly, even in front of the courthouse. What had started as a disagreement had turned into a violent feud with attacks and acts of revenge that spread fear throughout the entire county. It's easy to see this as just one tragic story involving two families caught in a cycle of violence. But the Howard-Turner feud may have been part of something much larger. As we look closer, we'll see that conflicts like this were not as rare as they might seem. And understanding why they happened can tell us a lot about the culture and history of the region. When we look beyond Harlan and examine the Appalachian region as a whole, a surprising pattern appears. Violence and family feuds were not isolated events. In many communities, conflicts like these happened often enough to become a familiar part of life. What seemed like a single tragedy was actually connected to a much broader cultural pattern. The Howard-Turner feud wasn't the only one. Many people have heard of the Hatfield-McCoy feud, but that was just one example. Across the mountains of Kentucky and West Virginia, families became trapped in similar cycles of revenge and violence that lasted for years, sometimes even generations. Whether it was the French and Eversole families, or the Martins and Tollivers, the details were different, but the pattern was often the same. Conflicts driven by honor, retaliation, and long-standing grudges. The scale of the violence was remarkable. In one small town, a court clerk found records of nearly 1,000 murder indictments filed over just a few decades. This was in a region with fewer than 15,000 people. Numbers like these show that the violence was not limited to a handful of famous feuds. It was part of a much larger pattern that affected communities across the region. A pattern this widespread cannot be explained by personal grudges alone. To understand it, sociologists looked at the culture of the region. They argue that many of these feuds grew out of a social system known as a culture of honor, a set of beliefs that placed a strong importance on protecting one's reputation and responding to insults or threats. So, what is a culture of honor? It is a society where a person's reputation is extremely important. In these communities, respect and toughness were closely tied to a person's status and security. Because of that, people felt a strong need to show that they could not be easily threatened or taken advantage of. Even minor insults or challenges were often taken very seriously, since allowing them to go unanswered could be seen as a sign of weakness. So, where does a culture like this come from? According to researchers, it often develops in herding societies rather than farming communities. Farmers usually depend on cooperation with their neighbors, but herdsmen face a different challenge. Their animals can be stolen quickly, taking away much of their wealth overnight. In that kind of environment, people often need a reputation for strength and toughness. Showing that they were willing to defend what was theirs could help discourage others from taking advantage of them. To understand why this culture became so deeply rooted in Appalachia, we need to look at the people who settled there. Their story begins long before they arrived in America. To find the origins of this culture, we have to cross the Atlantic and trace their history back to the lands their ancestors once called home. The people who settled Harlan and much of the Appalachian region were largely Scotch-Irish. Their ancestors came from the borderlands between Scotland and England, a region known for conflict and instability. For generations, many lived as herdsmen in remote areas where families often relied on themselves for protection. Over time, values such as loyalty, toughness, and defending one's reputation became deeply rooted in their culture. When they came to America, many settled in the rugged and isolated Appalachian Mountains, a landscape that felt familiar to the one they had left behind. As historian David Hackett Fisher explains, the culture of honor was more than just a tradition carried from the old country. On the often dangerous and lawless American frontier, it served a practical purpose. In many ways, these values helped people survive in an environment where formal law and protection were often limited. The culture was well suited to the challenges they faced in their new home. At this point, it might sound like we're talking about a culture that disappeared long ago. But the surprising part is that its influence can still be seen today. Researchers have found evidence that some of these cultural values have lasted for generations, leaving patterns that can still be observed and measured in modern society. In the 1990s, two psychologists at the University of Michigan, Dov Cohen and Richard Nisbet, designed an experiment to test this idea. They wanted to see whether the culture of honor still influenced the behavior of young men from the American South. Their approach was simple but clever. They created a situation in which the participants would be insulted and then observed how they reacted. The experiment was surprisingly simple. A student was asked to walk down a narrow hallway. As he passed by, a researcher working on the study deliberately bumped into him and quietly muttered an insult. The researchers then carefully observed what happened next, measuring both the students' physical reactions and their behavior. The results were remarkable. For many of the students from the North, the insult caused little change in their stress levels. But for many of the students from the South, the reaction was much stronger. Their bodies showed significant increases in cortisol, a stress hormone, and testosterone, which is often linked to competitive and aggressive responses. A single insult triggered a noticeably larger biological reaction, suggesting that cultural values can influence how people respond to challenges and threats. The experiment didn't stop there. Later, the students walked down the hallway again, this time toward a large man who was taking up much of the space. Most students from the North stepped aside early to avoid a collision. The students from the South who had been insulted behaved differently. They continued walking toward him and waited much longer before moving aside. Their behavior suggested a stronger desire to avoid appearing intimidated or weak, even in a situation that could lead to confrontation. And this is what made the results so surprising. The students in the experiment were not from isolated mountain communities. Many grew up in modern cities and came from professional families. Their parents were often doctors, lawyers, and business people, not herdsmen. Yet when their honor was challenged, they responded in ways that reflected cultural values that had been passed down for generations. It was a powerful reminder that the influence of history can remain long after the original conditions that created it have disappeared. This brings us to the central lesson of the story. Culture is a powerful force with a long memory. The values, beliefs, and habits we inherit can be passed from one generation to the next, lasting for centuries. Even after the original circumstances have disappeared, those cultural traditions can continue to shape how people think, behave, and respond to the world around them. This leaves us with an important idea to consider. Where we come from can shape us in ways we do not always notice. Not just our hometowns, but also the experiences, values, and traditions passed down through our families over many generations. The story of Appalachia reminds us that the past can continue to influence the present, often in ways that remain hidden until we take a closer look. Thank you for joining us today. We will see you again in the next chapter.
If you'd like more personalized feedback, writing support, and discussion sessions, they're available with me or with our selected tutors. All the details are here.